Welcome to Youth Voices in Mental Health, a podcast produced by and about the personal experiences of NAMI New York State's Next Gen Youth Council. Harnessing the spirit of the next generation of mental health advocates, this show will cover topics from how to get help and finding community to self-care tips and mental health news. Today's episode is about college students and stress levels. Welcome to this episode of Youth Voices in Mental Health, the podcast hosted by the members of NAMI New York State's Youth Advisory Group. The Youth Advisory Group is a 10-person lived experience group of young adults in New York State dedicated to guiding NAMI towards more inclusive, kinder, and innovative outcomes for mental health. My name's Connor. I currently live in Poughkeepsie and go to Vassar College. Given that I'm a college student who experiences stress and mental health problems, and with current surveys suggesting that more than 60% of college students fall into the diagnostic criteria for a mental health problem, and 3/4 reporting moderate to severe psychological distress, it's really important that we have conversations like this about mental health, college-age students, stress, all of the compounding factors that lead students to deal with mental health problems. So today, I'm very lucky to be joined by Wes Dixon. Wesley Dixon serves as the Deputy to the President and Secretary of the Board of Trustees at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Wes has an interest in public health and young people, and before coming to Vassar, served as the program manager at the Global Health Leadership Institute at Yale. He currently serves on the board of the Mid-Hudson Discovery Museum and the Vassar Brothers Medical Center. Thank you for joining us, Wes.
Thanks for having me here, Connor. I'm super excited to talk to you, and it's a very important conversation, and I'm so grateful to be having it with you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think the best way to structure this episode is to talk about questions. I mean, obviously you've gone through an undergraduate and graduate education, and now you are on the other side of it, working with college students as an administrator. So I think you're a very valuable voice to have as we talk about this. So I think the first question that I have for you is, what do you think can be done to improve college students' mental health broadly?
Yeah. So first of all, again, thanks for having me here, Connor. I'm super excited and honored to be having the conversation with you. And I just want to sort of, before I start talking, I want to just caveat that, of course, I work in higher education. I'm a person. I'm relatively young. I have family members and friends who have mental health struggles or experiences or crises. So I have those levels of data points. I do want to say that I'm not a clinician. I just want to make that super clear. There are great people at Vassar who have different roles in our counseling center who are trained to be mental health counselors and therapists. And so I just want to sort of amplify and uplift the work that they do every single day, and sort of just caveat that what I say is informed, but definitely not sort of professionally, I'm not trained in that area, but nonetheless, happy to have this conversation with you because it's important for people to have it at all levels and all kinds of roles, I think, particularly in higher education. In terms of what can be done, I think to just increase overall mental well-being among college students and people in that age range. And I say that in part because I think we happen to be sort of on a college campus today, and I think going to a college allows for certain kinds of resources for mental health that may not be available to those in the same age range who don't go to college in the way we do at Vassar, but they still have mental health issues, right? And so I want to make that caveat because I think it's important to think about different distinct populations of young people and how we might be able to think about strategies differently based on who they are in terms of how we can address their mental health. But I do think these might sound very abstract and very corny, quote unquote, but I think they're really important. I think to the extent that in a young person's development, whether that's through their family, through their elementary, middle, primary education, pre-college or college age activities, I think real investment in thinking about things that are as simple as sense of self, confidence, sort of purpose, which is an ongoing question, but thinking about those in really earnest and meaningful ways, I think really start to create meaningful reservoirs, so to speak, for young people when they inevitably experience mental health crises in their life. I say that because I want us to destigmatize mental health, the range of mental health crises as things that only some people experience. That's just not true. Every individual on this planet is going to experience at some point in time a mental health, I don't want to say episode, but a moment where their mental health is less stalled, less strong than they want it to be at equilibrium, right? And so we're all going to have moments where we experience stress and anxiety forms of depression. That's a very human thing to experience. And I think it's wonderful to be able to say that openly and clearly and without any sort of stigma. And so because we are necessarily all going to experience versions of that at some point in time, I think one of the things that we can do to prepare ourselves for when that happens is to build this reservoir of sort of positive emotion, coping skills, knowing how we can lean into tactics that help us get back to center, so to speak, when these things happen, right? And those things differ for every person. But I think having a conversation with yourself, with loved ones, with providers about what the things are that keep you feeling whole, grounded, and centered early on in a preventative way are really great investments in making sure that when we do experience moments of crisis at any point on the spectrum, we know how to address it personally, right? Because the truth is, our own sort of ability to handle mental health crises are very personally informed decisions, right? We all have different needs and different ways of responding. And so to be aware of yourself in that way, I think is really important. And I think it will pay dividends in terms of us being able to address our own mental health in whatever environment we're in. In a college setting, I do think there are ways that we can provide more resource or provide sufficient or some resources to support mental health well-being among our students, right? Some of those are as simple as, creating, of course, having a counseling and mental health center as part of a student health sort of apparatus. But then with that comes making those services accessible, making them well-known, thinking about the hours of those services such that students can access them during time where they're not in class or in ways that are responsive to student schedules, if you will. Here at Vassar, some of the things that we do to support mental health, among other things, is we have lots of group therapies that are groups based on a range of different identities or shared experiences, whether that is gender-based, racially ethnic-based, life experience-based, like, for example, having a parent or two that's deceased, whatever the things might be. There are a range of different opportunities here at Vassar that make the entryway into mental health care easier to find and more accessible. So I'm sure there's many more things I can say, but I'll start with that, just in terms of some of the things that we can do to help support mental health and well-being on campuses.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a college student, I 100% agree and echo everything that you were saying. I mean, from the very academic side, like we talk a lot in my developmental psych classes because I'm a psych major about like epigenetic experiences, things you're exposed to as a young person. It's not only what's encoded into your DNA and your genes, it's literal experiences you have that fundamentally alter the way that your genes are expressed, your proteins are coded, and the way that you live. So I totally agree with what you're saying there. And then again, I think that the best thing that someone can do, a college can do, an institution, something that works for young people, for college-stage people, is to offer a variety of resources. Like, yes, group therapy works for some, and that's great that we have that option. Maybe someone else wants individual therapy, which is great because, Vassar has that and connects people that do that in the community, not just on the college, but in the community, which is another important thing. Also different mediums of therapy, whether it's online therapy. Again, Vassar has therapy assistance online, which is very helpful for the students that want that, or telehealth, versus just traditional, sitting face-to-face in a room like this, in-person therapy. If you can accommodate the most people through a variety of different resources and, offering them in different ways, I think that that's really the best thing you can do.
Absolutely. And to your point about sort of a range of resources, I will say too, and I think Vassar does a decent job at this, is recognizing that because of these different sort of epigenetic experiences we all have, the range of people who are providing the mental health services is also very important too, right? So of course, this is true in many domains, not just in mental health care, but particularly mental health care, having counselors and therapists who come from a wide range of different backgrounds or are at least fluent or comfortable in dealing with young people who have different experiences is really critical, because the truth is people need to feel comfortable with their mental health care providers, and comfort, the variable of comfort comes from a lot of different things. Sometimes it comes from a feeling like there is understanding or familiarity based on the domains of whatever it is, socioeconomic status, income, race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all those things are very important. And so I think for those who are listening who may be at places where they're building a mental health practice, thinking about the diversity of those who are providing the care, I think is very important.
100%. And also the distinction between emergency and emergent care versus, more continual care is something that's very important. Like at Vassar, you always have access to a therapist on call, like an emergency therapist on call. But, you also have the 9 to 5 operating
Correct.
hours of continual therapy. So I think building in the emergency stuff, the constant stuff is very, very important when it comes to colleges.
Definitely.
The next question that I have, and I think will be interesting because I think this speaks not only to the climate of mental health on campuses and, in spaces where young people live and work, but also just the broader world and the world of mental health. What changes have you seen in your time going through college yourself to now in terms of the ways that mental health is treated, talked about on campuses?
Absolutely. Just for context, for those who are listening, I want to make it explicit. I went to college undergrad between the years of 2011 and 2015. So it's been about 10 years, roughly, since I graduated from college, been over 10 since I started college. I think things have changed significantly. I've had the privilege of going to institutions that were always relatively progressively leaning. So I think I was in a space where there was more relative acceptance of mental health conversation. But that being said, I still think there was much less fluency, much less conversation about mental health when I was in college. And what I mean by that is there were certainly instances and conversations about acute and extreme mental health crises. That, of course, has always existed as part of our society, unfortunately. And we were aware and sort of cognizant of that. To give some context, when I was in college, my senior year, I had a role where I was in school that was called a freshman counselor. So as a senior, living with freshmen in freshman dorms, we called them freshmen at that time, freshman dorms, and we were trained in lots of ways because we weren't quite an RA. It was a much less punitive sort of role than how I imagined RAs to be, but it was a role that was really one where we were overall supposed to be sort of like near peer support, but also advisors for our freshmen. We had groups of 12 to 15 freshmen. And so because freshman year comes with many sorts of things and experiences, we were trained in many ways about the mental health resources on our campus, how to sort of try and usher students to those if we felt they needed them, a range of things like that. But even at that time, as we talked about those resources at the time, they were clearly, I think we had a bias that most times you would have to engage mental health services when there was a very extreme or acute crisis. There was very little at that time conversation, at least to my knowledge or my memory, about sort of the omnipresent, consistent, lower level, but still meaningful mental health crises people might go through, right? And so there was not sort of, there wasn't a stigma against it necessarily, but there was not a widespread uptake in people like actively going to see their therapist, being excited about that in a preventative way. That was not sort of how we talked about it. It was very much like when there are signs of an issue that might be on the horizon very soon or something's happening right now, you engage in mental health services. But it was very rare, at least in my memory, that people were encouraged to sort of have mental health care as a routine, preventative, normative part of their overall healthcare apparatus. It just was not the norm, right? And maybe it happened individually for people because they had their own experiences that necessitated that. But from an administrative and cultural point of view, I just do not believe that I know that we were not talking about in the way we are now. Now, I think it's beautiful. It's sometimes sort of like an SNL skit to me. Like sometimes like going to therapy is like so in vogue that it's sort of like, I laugh, I chuckle, not because it's funny, but it's like compared to my earlier parts of my life where people had to be like convinced and goaded and like, secretly going to therapy. Now it's like people are like tripping over themselves to brag about their meetings with their therapist, how often they go, how much they love their therapist, how meaningful and cry-filled the session was today. I think it's beautiful, but that was not the world in which I grew up in when I was in my earlier educational years.
This episode of Youth Voices in Mental Health is brought to you by a grant from Macy's. As part of Macy's social purpose platform, Mission Everyone, which supports programming to create systemic change in youth mental health care across the country. Because the history of progress shows that when people feel confident to create their own story and pursue their dreams, they change the narrative for everyone.
I think something important you're mentioning there is the importance of, I guess in your college experience, a peer-to-peer resource and program. I think that to me is something that really drives mental health home. Is it's one thing if you're hearing it from an administrator or a therapist. It's another if you're hearing it from your RA, your advisor, your student fellow at Vassar, you know. And I think that that's something really interesting that students do is when gaps exist in what a college can offer you. We fill in the gaps. So whether it's a peer-run chat line, like a non-emergency chat line like we have at Vassar that a lot of other institutions have in New York and around the country, of, you know, log on between these hours if you want to talk to a student who's been QPR trained, who's just a listening ear, and you want to chat, hop on. And things like a peer support club where you come every Monday at 7 p.m. and sit in a circle and talk about something that's, again, not an emergent thing. It's not like a severe, like, depressive episode. It's just, oh, tell us about the last time you've been sad. And it's not a clinical thing. It's just, you know, getting people talking, sharing their experiences. And I think things like that and also COVID, you know, really got people talking about mental health, have led us to where we are today of, you know, talking about mental health like what it is, which is just an aspect of physical
part
health.
of life.
I guess then we can move to the last question, which is, I think, one that we might never have the answer to, obviously, but what barriers exist to actually going in and providing students with adequate mental health resources? Like, I know from the preliminary research I did on this topic, money is obviously a huge thing, and a lot of schools actually, which I didn't even know it existed. I think this would be a different conversation if Vassar was like this, but you have to actually pay for therapy on a college campus, which is so unfortunate, but, you know, a very true fact. So I think we're privileged in talking about this as in, you know, it's free and accessible in so many ways here at this college in New York. But maybe at other schools or even still at Vassar, what are some barriers?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And as I mentioned earlier, I think my sense is the barriers, there are some that are consistent across all or many students, and there are some that are probably individually informed. So I think let's start with individually informed ones. Of course, there are some social, political, sort of cultural barriers that I think we'd be wise to take into account as we think about how to reach the largest number of students in care, by which I mean it is the case still that there are demographic groups in this country, and I would imagine the maps onto here at Vassar, where mental health care broadly defined is still stigmatized more than not, right? So the very famous and successful actor Courtney Vance just wrote a book about this with a colleague of his a couple of years ago. His father committed suicide when he was growing up, and Courtney Vance has reflected on the impact of that on his overall life, but also his sense of mental health among Black men and Black boys. And the unfortunate truth is, among Black men and Black boys still, there are significantly lower levels of access to care and penetration of care. Even if there's access, uptake of care is very low among that population for a whole range of social and cultural reasons, right? Not to sort of diminish those, but I think it's important to recognize as we think about strategies for care, we can't ignore the fact that there are these cultural and social reasons that for some reason make it harder for folks to want to get care. So that, I think, is just a statement on that. Institutionally here at Vassar, I think you're right. We are very privileged. We can always do better, but we're very privileged to not be starting from a deficit, if you will, relative to our peers at other places in terms of our ability to provide care. I think one of the things that I understand from my colleagues in mental health and counseling that is a barrier to care here is that we have a perception, I don't want to call it a truth, but there's a perception that it's very possible you can go seek care and then for a whole range of reasons be forced to take a leave of absence, not be able to complete your studies, then fall behind in your college trajectory. The perception of that is a very big deal because I think people feeling like they aren't able to both get care and complete their studies prevents them from seeking care, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think finding both communications tools to make clear sort of that you can seek care and also continue studies is important. And I will say that at Vassar we are piloting something called an intensive outpatient care program here on campus, because the truth is when someone sometimes does have intensive, severe, acute needs, they sometimes have to get those treated off campus in ways that make their studies here hard to maintain. And so we are piloting or exploring ways in which we can have on-site intensive outpatient care such that folks can receive care for severe mental health issues and also still be enrolled in school at the same time. So I think that is both a barrier, but also a potential solution to thinking about some of those barriers as well. What I will say also is some barriers, you highlighted them earlier, but they apply here as well, are things like cost and logistics. Vassar is not set up on campus to support sort of, as you noted earlier, consistent long-term emergent care, right? That's not sort of the way that our on-campus services are set up. But we do, I think, thankfully have great resources through our care management system, through student studies and students office to connect students with sustainable long-term care in the community, right? That's great, and that's something that not everyone has. At the same time, sometimes the barriers are students have to then have copays they can't afford to pay, or they have to get transportation to the care facility that they're going to get their services at, right? And so we at Vassar work very hard for students who are on financial aid or have other financial demonstrated need to do things like cover the copays or cover the transportation to get that care. And so again, we're far from perfect here at Vassar, but those are some strategies that I think we've used to mitigate the effects of some of the barriers that I know exist at other schools in the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scary stat, but some studies and research has shown that on a college campus, half of the students that are diagnosed with a mental illness or mental health issue do not seek care from their college. And I think that that's eye-opening. I think the stat at Vassar is it's 60% of people by the time they graduate have visited counseling at least once.
Yeah.
And, that doesn't include people that already have connections with, a therapist back home or something like that.
Right.
But I think that there is definitely something to be said about, stigma keeping people back still. I mean, you're a busy college student. You're expected to be perfect, to get good grades, get a job,
Right.
like all this stuff. Where do you fit in the 1 hour for a therapy session? And it's sad because, would you fit in that 1 hour session if you broke your leg? Yes.
Absolutely.
But would you fit in the 1 hour session if you feel like you can't get out of bed, you can't brush your teeth, you're not, keeping up with self-care, you're falling behind academically? Maybe not. It's still seen as something different, even for me, as someone that has done this mental health advocacy work for 5 years now at least. If I wake up one morning and my stomach hurts, I'm like, oh yeah, I should go to the doctor. But if I just, feel really low, I'm like, okay, got to get through the day. Let's just put on the shoes and get out of the dorm.
I know we're at times. I just want to say one more thing before we close at the point you just made. One thing that happened at Vassar several years ago that I think speaks to what you're saying is we had a great young administrator here who put on a photojournalism project, if you will, and it was wonderful because the premise of the project was there were pictures of individual people, all who struggled in their own way with mental health issues in their life or at that moment. But the insight, I think, of her project was that people in that exhibition ranged from students, of course, but also to tenured faculty, full professors, administrators, dining hall workers, whomever. And it was great because, to your point about stigma, at least at Vassar, that project, I think, worked really hard to try to destigmatize mental health among populations that would otherwise think about it as something that was sort of a detriment to them and to their well-being or to their personhood, if you will. And I think seeing full professors and faculty members saying, I have and I do struggle with mental health makes it easier for someone like you in a student role to say, okay, it's very safe for me then to say to someone, I know the deadline was today. I have to be honest, I've been having a mental health crisis. I'm so sorry. Can we talk about a new deadline? Those kinds of conversations may not happen if there's no open conversation about people who are in high power roles, given their role at an institution like faculty, saying, I too deal with this, and as such, I understand how it might impact you. And so again, we're far from perfect here at Vassar, but I think there are some examples of things that we've done that help to get at some of the things you're talking about.
Absolutely. College is not just about students, it's about everyone, and that goes on into life. So just to close out, thank you so much, Wes, for joining me. I know that all of the listeners will be very happy to hear your perspective and to be talking about mental health. College-age people, many of the listeners are college-age people, so it's very important. Once again, this was an episode of Youth Voices in Mental Health, which is the podcast created by NAMI New York State's Youth Advisory Group. If you'd like to learn more, you can follow the Instagram page of NAMI New York State, which is at NAMI, NAMI-NYS, NAMI New York State. Thank you, Vassar College, and thank you, Wes, for having me and for joining.
And thank you, Carter, for all the work you're doing and for all the work your colleagues and friends are doing. It's very important, and things don't get better unless we have folks fighting the good fight like you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of course.
This episode of Youth Voices in Mental Health was produced by Conversations at the Salt Line, Vassar College's podcast, and featured the voices of Connor Dalgaard and Wesley Dixon. NAMI New York State is the state chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, the largest grassroots mental health organization dedicated to building better lives for the millions of Americans affected by mental illness. We provide advocacy, education, support, and public awareness so that individuals and families affected by mental illness can build better lives. For more information, go to naminys.org.